According to a recent BBC poll, between 2013 and 2019, the number of people across the Arab world who identified as not religious rose from 8% to 13%. Among those under 30, that number reached as high as 18%. In fact, in every country surveyed except for Yemen, non-religious identification increased. The Egyptian journalist Khaled Diab described it as a tsunami of atheism. Now, whether it's really a tsunami or just a ripple is up for debate, but one thing is clear: something is changing in the religious landscape of Arab countries. Non-religious views are becoming more visible and harder to ignore. And for a long time, scholars of religion did ignore non-religion in Arab countries. We can speculate a few reasons for this blind spot. The Moroccan journalist Ahmed Ben Chemsi thought it was a lack of imagination among many Western researchers, who couldn't even fathom an Arab atheist. Back in 1991, the scholar Ernest Geller claimed that secularization simply hadn't happened in the Islamic world, and maybe couldn't, declaring, "I think it is fair to say that no secularization has taken place in the world of Islam, and that Islam is as strong now than it was 100 years ago." Apparently, he was one of many scholars who were not noticing the development going on under the surface. Another reason for this blind spot is that studying Arab non-religion poses several serious challenges. As in, it's not just overlooked, it's hard to access. Researchers face limited data, hidden communities, and real risks for both participants and the scholars. As we'll see later in this video, atheism is stigmatized and sometimes even criminalized in many Arab-majority countries. So non-religious views tend to stay underground, shared only in private groups. Many official government statistics are also unreliable, claiming a near totally religious population, and much of mainstream media in the Arab world either ignores or actively censors discussions about atheism and secularism. That means fewer public discussions, fewer visible movements, and until recently, less academic research. Also, as we've seen in other videos in the series on non-religion, the terminology can get really tricky. Not everyone who steps away from religion automatically calls themselves an atheist. Some identify as agnostic, secular, spiritual but not religious, or skeptical. And that's just in English. How do we talk about non-religion in Arabic and in a Muslim-majority context? So, for a long time, non-religion in Arab-majority countries flew under the academic radar. But things are starting to change. More and more scholars have started paying attention, and not just to big-picture trends, but to the day-to-day lives of Arabs stepping away from religion. Some scholars have focused on the risks and stigma facing Egyptian atheists on YouTube. Others have documented everyday forms of secular activism in places like Morocco or Lebanon. In Tunisia, researchers are examining how the internet is creating new digital spaces for questioning Islam. The scholar Karen von Newkirk has looked at what it actually feels like both emotionally and socially to move in and out of Islam. The research is still catching up, but the conversation is no longer invisible. So what exactly have these researchers found? First, let's lay the groundwork. We're focusing on non-religion in the Arab world. This includes 22 countries, such as Morocco, Algeria, Palestine, Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. That's different from the Middle East, which is a fuzzier term that includes non-Arab countries like Iran and Turkey. Now, Iran and Turkey are both absolutely fascinating case studies in their own right when it comes to secularization, but this episode focuses on Arab-majority countries specifically. Out of the roughly 300 million people living in these countries, most are Muslims, but there are also millions of non-Muslims too, including Christians, Jews, Baha'is, Druze, Mandeans, and Yazidis. Just as a quick example, Coptic Christians make up around 10% or more of Egypt's population. So while we will be focusing a lot on disaffiliation from Islam in this video, we should not forget about this religious diversity in Arab-majority countries. Okay, now let's talk about terminology, because words like atheism, non-belief, or agnosticism don't always translate neatly across cultures or languages. In English, atheism usually means a lack of belief in God or gods. It's shaped a lot by Protestant Christian ideas where belief is personal and central to religion. But when we look at non-religion in the Arab world with a history shaped by Islam and the Arabic language, those frameworks don't quite fit. Even the Arabic word we translate as religion, deen, carries very different connotations. Deen is tied to concepts of obligation, duty, and a structured way of life rather than just personal belief. The root of the word deen is etymologically connected to the word dine, meaning debt, reinforcing the idea that deen is something one owes or is bound to. Rejecting those obligations is called kufr. often translated as unbelief or infidelity, but the root of the word itself means to cover or conceal, and over time it came to refer to those who reject or deny the truth. So kufr isn't only about disbelief, it's about turning away from what is seen as rightful duty. A lot of academics have explored the complex constellation of Arabic terms related to non-religion. Shirk is often translated as idolatry or polytheism, though it specifically refers to associating anything else with God, violating the Islamic principle of tawhid, that there is no God but God. Next, there's Zandaka, a term historically used to describe heresy or unorthodox beliefs. It's a broad and often pejorative label applied to everyone from theological deviants to outright atheists. Being accused of Zandaka can have severe political and religious implications depending on the country and the context. The Quran describes those who actively reject divine truth with the word juhud. Unlike passive non-belief, this implies an intentional rejection of what is perceived as truth. Now, as for secularism, Arabic doesn't have an exact equivalent, though it's either translated as ilmaniya or alamaniya, from the roots meaning science and the world respectively. Atheism is called ilhad, and an atheist is a mulhid. Though these terms are not etymologically linked to God, like how the English word atheism derives from the Greek word for God, theos. Instead, they carry connotations of deviation, rejection, or rebellion. As it's used today, though, ilhad is the closest term in Arabic to what is known as positive atheism, which refers to the explicit rejection of the existence of God or gods, as opposed to simply lacking belief in them. But there's a growing set of terms built around the word la, meaning no, la adri, meaning I don't know, and maps onto agnosticism, and la din, meaning no religion, which has become an increasingly common term of self-description. It's a relatively new term, likely coined in the early 2000s, and many prefer it because it avoids the stigma attached to some of the more derogatory words we've seen so far. Though some non-religious activists have started reclaiming these more derogatory terms, like kafir, infidel, zendik, heretic, or mulhid, atheist, but using them in an ironic way to push back against religious stigma. For example, the content creator Hisham Nostik published his memoirs entitled Memoirs of a Moroccan Kafir. So some non-religious Arabs self-consciously use these theologically loaded terms to normalize non-religion and temporarily challenge the expectation that non-religion should be kept hidden or stigmatized. Though in general, Ladin is perceived as a less stigmatized and more neutral term that encompasses many forms of disengaging from Islam and avoids the negative connotations of many of these other terms. So non-religion in Arabic-speaking societies is complicated, not just in practice, but in language. And that adds to the difficulty of studying non-religion in these countries. Many of the available terms come from a religious framework, which means they are not neutral labels. They carry moral weight. If the only words to describe yourself imply deviance or heresy, would you use them in an interview with a sociologist? So it's not just a question of what people believe, it's also about how language and society limits the way non-religion can be expressed. So all of this brings us back to that study we started with. What is the state of non-religion in Arab-majority countries? The largest survey on this topic was a partnership between BBC News Arabic and the Arab Barometer, a nonpartisan research network based out of Princeton that focused on the beliefs and values of citizens across the Arab world. In 2018 and 2019, they surveyed 25,000 people in 11 Arab countries, and according to their results, there has been a meaningful increase in the number of people who say they are not religious between 2013 and 2019. As we mentioned at the start, rising across the region from 8% to 13%. The changes varied, though, from country to country. There were especially large shifts in Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, and Morocco. In fact, Tunisia clocked in at over 30% of the population reporting to be non-religious. The study also found that Arabs are losing trust in Islamist parties and Islamic religious leaders. They're attending mosque less often, and young people report higher rates of non-religion, with the proportion of non-religious individuals under 30 being as high as 18%. Yet more recent research from Arab Barometer shows that the trend has been slightly reversed, especially among Arab youth. For example, as of 2023 in Tunisia, 18 to 29-year-olds are 15 points less likely to say they are non-religious than in 2020. Significant declines were also found in Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, Algeria, and Palestine. So instead of a sharp increase in non-religion, it seems that there are some shifts in the data. And survey data always comes with limitations, especially when it relies on self-identification. In contexts where atheism is taboo or even criminalized, people often avoid labeling themselves as non-religious, which means the real numbers could be higher than what the surveys actually report. And once again, as we've seen, terminology matters. In Arab Barometer surveys between 2007 and 2018, participants could choose between non-believer and non-religious, or non-practicing. While the latter term could include atheists or agnostics, it usually implies someone who simply is less observant, not someone who has fully stepped away from religion. It carries a different connotation from Ladin, no religion, which signals a more complete break from Islam. Only about 1% of respondents identified as non-believers, while non-religious ranged from 15 to 30%.
So, as the scholar Sebastian Elsesser argues,
claims that non-believers are a constantly growing group in Arab societies since the 2010s rest on shaky empirical grounds. In the absence of more finely grained survey methods, we are left to guess how Arab respondents define religiosity and being non-religious, and how their self-descriptions might be distorted by desirability and prevalent social norms. But what if you could measure religiosity without asking people anything at all? One Arab Barometer study tried to do exactly that, by measuring religiosity from space. Researchers used satellite imagery to track nighttime activity during Ramadan. The idea was simple. If people are fasting during the day, they're more likely to stay up later at night to eat and socialize, so more lights should be visible after dark in more observant communities. They compared this satellite data with survey responses from different governments in Egypt. They found that for most regions, the change in nighttime light during Ramadan was minimal, just a slight uptick. But in some regions, the increase in light was more pronounced. And in those cases, there was a strong correlation between the rise in lights and the levels of religiosity reported in surveys. So the goal of the study was to test how reliable survey data really is. There's understandable skepticism around religiosity surveys in the Arab world, as people may underreport or overreport their beliefs due to social pressure. But this study suggests that at least on the provincial level in Egypt, survey results do line up with observable practice. And a separate study in Turkey found a similar pattern. Changes in nighttime lights during Ramadan matches self-reported rates of fasting. So the Arab Barometer data may be relatively trustworthy, showing a modest increase in non-religion throughout the 2010s with a possible pullback since 2020. But context matters too. To state the obvious, each Arab country has its own culture, history, laws, and political system. So the range of non-religious experiences varies a lot. Being non-religious in Lebanon or Tunisia differs from being non-religious in Saudi Arabia. While freedom of conscience is a constitutional right in both Lebanon and Tunisia, leaving Islam is considered illegal in Saudi Arabia. So let's have a closer look at some of these countries. In Saudi Arabia, a royal decree was issued in 2014 criminalizing atheism by classifying it as a form of terrorism. But despite the legal consequences of leaving Islam, the journalist Khaled Diab reports that there is a vibrant atheistic underground in Saudi Arabia. He quotes a non-religious Saudi. "We non-believers have meetings and groups in a lot of Saudi cities. If you go into them, then you will be shocked by the numbers and elements of society represented." Meanwhile, in Tunisia and Lebanon, freedom of conscience is technically protected by the constitution, and being non-religious is not a criminal offense. Non-religious organizations operate openly without major interference from the state. Groups like the Tunisian Free Thinkers and Free Thought Lebanon are active in public life. In Beirut, for example, Free Thought Lebanon has hosted events like Café Humaniste, gatherings that include lectures, debates, and film screenings on topics like secular funerals, civil marriages, and electoral reform. Though their activism is deeply tied to local concerns and framed around citizenship, not just around religion. The Tunisian Free Thinkers came onto the scene after the 2011 uprisings, pushing for changes to things like Islamic inheritance laws, which they say discriminate against women. In 2017, around 200 Tunisians, both Muslims and non-Muslims, started protesting with the slogan, "Not by force," in response to 4 men being sentenced to a month in jail for eating and smoking in public during Ramadan. The situation escalated when a conservative imam began filming and publicly shaming those who were not fasting. This shows that even in countries where freedom of conscience is technically protected by the Constitution, and where libraries and bookshops can carry non-religious books, certain expressions of non-religiosity can lead to social discrimination. Without formal blasphemy laws in these countries, to crack down on non-religion, authorities often rely on vague charges like offending public decency or disturbing public order. One example is the Tunisian Jabour Medri, who posted caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad online and was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, though he was pardoned after serving 2. The case of the French-Tunisian filmmaker Nadia El Fani is another example. El Fani is known for her outspoken atheism, and she published a documentary in 2011 that explored freedom from religious constraints in post-revolution Tunisia. After its release and her public criticism of Islam, she faced death threats and protests at screenings. Now, of course, not every Muslim is strictly observant all the time, and in many places there's at least some tolerance for folks who don't follow every religious norm to the letter. According to anthropologist Lena Richter's research on young urban non-believers in Morocco, being non-religious is often tolerated as long as you keep it low-key. Speaking out can come with risks like damaged relationships or losing your job.
A recent case from Morocco illustrates just how quickly visibility can become dangerous. In 2025, the Moroccan feminist activist Betty Lashkar was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison on blasphemy charges after a photo circulated online of her wearing a t-shirt that read, "Allah is lesbian." The image had originally been posted years earlier, but once it resurfaced on social media, hundreds of users called for her arrest and tagged Moroccan police. Authorities charged her under laws prohibiting offenses against Islam. Her case shows how, even in countries without sweeping apostasy laws, public irreverence, especially when tied to gender and sexuality, can provoke both digital outrage and state prosecution.
Many navigate this by leading a kind of double life, staying silent in public and sharing their views only with trusted friends or in private online spaces. For activists, though, visibility can mean serious consequences. For many, the safest way to connect with like-minded people is online. Many non-religious Arabs have turned to social media to find community and broadcast their ideas. Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, they've all seen a surge in non-religious pages, forums, and channels from Arab content creators. YouTube channels like the Syrian agnostic Qosay Battar, Egyptian author Hamid Abdel Samad, who's known for his YouTube series Box of Islam, and the Moroccan Hisham Nostik. Though Sharif Gabr has probably become one of the most prominent voices in the Arab atheist scene. He's an Egyptian YouTuber with over 500,000 subscribers, known for using satire and sketch to critique Islamic doctrine. One of his most viewed videos is Muslim Meets God, which has racked up over 3 million views. His story also reveals the sharp limits of free expression in Egypt. It began at his university when he challenged a professor who called homosexuality a disease. This led to a chain of legal trouble. He was arrested in 2013 for contempt of religion, released on bail, and later sentenced to a year in prison. In 2018, he was banned from leaving the country, and a few years later, he received another 4-year sentence and went into hiding. Then in 2024, a fundamentalist lawyer filed a complaint against him for inciting atheism, leading to another 5-year sentence. He still posts occasionally but remains in hiding. And across many of these social platforms, you might recognize a lot of similar strategies if you've watched any atheist content creators in the West. Like their counterparts who challenge Christian fundamentalism or debunk claims about biblical inerrancy, Arab non-religion creators challenge Quranic miracles or point out logical flaws and historical contradictions. Linguistically, many of these creators choose to read the Quran in their local Arabic dialect rather than classical Arabic. It's a deliberate move to make the content more relatable and informal, but it also subtly challenges the sacred status of Quranic language. When someone like Hisham Nostik reads a verse in his Moroccan dialect, it just hits differently. Some content mirrors what you often see in Christian deconversion content. Just as so-called ex-evangelicals recount their previous evangelical life of prayer, church attendance, and Bible study to prove that they were really real believers, many ex-Muslim creators highlight their deep prior commitment to Islam. This is an effort to push back against claims that they were misinformed, secularized, or never truly devout to begin with. Many also share personal stories about the emotional and intellectual struggle it took to leave. So for example, check out shows like The Black Ducks, hosted by the Egyptian atheist Isma Muhammad, and Box of Islam, hosted by author Hamid Abdel Samad. They both feature personal testimonies that walk viewers through their journey from belief to non-belief. These narratives often emphasize deep prior engagement with Islam to challenge the idea that leaving Islam is just the result of ignorance or alienation. Some also highlight historical figures who made similar journeys. One recurring example is Abdullah al-Qasimi, a Saudi intellectual who studied at Al-Azhar in Egypt, one of Islam's most prestigious centers of learning. Before renouncing his faith entirely, he went on to become one of the most prominent Arab critics of Islam.
But online testimonies and academics only tell part of the story. What does Arab atheism actually look like in everyday life? In some cases, leaving religion looks more like a clean break. The scholar Anthony Jackson interviewed several self-described atheists in Egypt and found trajectories that in some ways resemble the familiar new atheist arc seen in Western contexts: intellectual doubts, online debates, satire, and a decisive rejection of religion. One man Dr. Jackson interviewed said his doubts deepened after he encountered Egyptian atheist influencers online. At first, their satire scandalized him, but he kept watching. And eventually he found himself laughing along and later openly identifying as atheist. Another interviewee, a woman named Shireen, shows how a clean break can be emotional as much as intellectual. Raised in Cairo's upscale neighborhood Zamalek, she grew up in a loosely Coptic Christian home, until her mother converted to Islam. As a teenager, she tried to follow along, but during Ramadan she said she couldn't feel anything, even when she forced herself to fast and tried to make herself feel moved. The decisive moment came later, watching her father die from a painful illness. In her interview, she said, "I have no proof that God doesn't exist, but even if he does, I don't care. I'm angry at him." For Shireen, leaving religion meant stepping out of what she called a brainwashed society and into a secular way of thinking and living. But sometimes the label ex-Muslim can be misleading. The anthropologist Lena Richter, who conducted dozens of interviews with non-religious Moroccans, found that many don't experience their shift as a clean break. One woman described going through an anger phase where she opposed everything related to Islam, but later she entered in what she called a phase of reconciliation. She no longer wanted to fit neatly into the category of atheist. Instead, she described herself as living a contradiction, firmly non-believing, but still culturally Muslim. For example, she still paid the zakat, one of the pillars of Islam in which Muslims give a percentage of one's savings to charity. When asked why she continued doing this, she explained that it felt like carrying forward a family tradition. My mom did it, my grandmother did it, so I also do it. Another interviewee, a former imam living in Europe, put it this way: "There are many things I still do, not for Islam, but simply because it is better for my quality of life, for society, and for nature." Though he no longer believes in Islam, he still fasts occasionally and avoids alcohol and pork, and values the discipline he learned through his former religion. Dr. Richter uses the term post-Muslim to describe this space. Former Muslims who don't identify themselves in opposition to Islam, but still maintain some level of continuity. For many, leaving Islam means renegotiating their past identity instead of erasing it completely. She writes, whereas Islam does not necessarily carry religious meaning for them any longer, it can still matter in terms of values, relations, and practices. Instead of categorically breaking with Islam, former Muslims show flexibility in selecting and reframing former religious practices in cultural terms. This range of identities fits a broader pattern that scholars see elsewhere. Non-religious identities are often ambiguous and layered. Think of people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, or self-described atheists who still believe in supernatural concepts. Religion is diverse and internally varied, and it turns out that non-religion is just as complex, taking many forms that resist simple labels.
So while the rise of non-religion in the Arab world may not be a tsunami, it's also not exactly a ripple. The movement is uneven and often at risk, but it's also undoubtedly larger than it was 20 years ago. And in a region where Islam has long shaped identity, law, and public life, even modest shifts in belief carry profound cultural weight. Now, we don't know if these trends will continue, reverse, or transform into something else entirely, but one thing is clear: non-belief in the Arab world can no longer be ignored.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching. This was our latest episode in our series on atheism. So if this topic interests you, definitely check out our earlier episodes here on the channel. So I hope while you're watching this video, you were thinking to yourself, okay, this topic is way more complex than I thought. I hope that was the case, because part of my mission here on Religion for Breakfast is, to borrow Hank Green's term, to complexify religion. But YouTube videos can really only go so far. At some point, you hit the end of the video, you're still thinking about the topic, and there's really nowhere for that curiosity to go. That's why I launched our online religious studies community, the Religion Department. It's a community where we bring in some serious scholars of religion to slow down and think together about religion. We have guest lectures, we have multi-week seminars, we have guided reading groups. We named it the Religion Department because that's what we're trying to build here, something that feels like a really great academic community, a place that you return to, a place where conversations build over time with people who take religion seriously as an academic subject and can't quite stop thinking about it. So I want to invite you to our next lecture, A Hidden History of Muslims in the US, with Dr. Yasmin Floden Ali. It'll be on March 3rd at 2:00 p.m. Eastern, and it costs whatever you want to register. She'll trace the history of Muslims in what's now the US all the way back to 1528. She'll go through the transatlantic slave trade, the Great Migration, immigration reform in 1965, and all the way into the late 20th century. She completely complicates the idea that Islam is somehow new to American life, and she also looks at the internal diversity of Muslim communities in the US. So if learning together about the long, often hidden history of Muslims in the US sounds compelling to you, I'd love for you to join. And for a limited time, when you register, you'll also receive a full bonus lecture, What You Don't Know About Jihad, taught by Dr. Elise Morgenstein First, which carefully breaks down the history and meaning of the concept. Just pay what you want to join, and that extra lecture will be waiting for you in your library. Just head on over to religiondepartment.com or click the link below. Hope to see you there.